The dawn of a new era. Transportation in post-colonial America. Before the year 1800, the lifeblood of the fledgling United States of America flowed not across its vast, untamed interior, but along its Atlantic coastline and across the ocean itself. The nation's trade and transportation network was overwhelmingly maritime. Commerce was a conversation conducted by ship, a dialogue between the great coastal cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Charleston, and their vital trading partners in Europe. These urban centers were islands of commerce, connected more intimately with London and Liverpool than with the rugged backcountry just 100 miles inland. To travel from Boston to Charleston was a journey best undertaken by sea, a voyage subject to the whims of wind and tide, but vastly preferable to the arduous, bone-jarring trek over rudimentary roads. Following the crucible of the War of 1812, a profound shift began to stir within the national consciousness. The conflict, often called the Second War for Independence, forged a new, more robust American identity. With its gaze no longer fixed so nervously upon Europe, the new nation was taking root, turning inward to contemplate the immense untapped potential of its own continent. A powerful current of migration began to pull people away from the crowded eastern seaboard, drawing them inland, westward. This movement was fueled by a demographic explosion. A steady wave of European immigration, combined with a high domestic birth rate, had doubled America's population in the preceding 25 years. In a testament to the nation's magnetic pull, it was destined to double again in the next quarter century. This burgeoning population needed room to breathe, land to cultivate, and resources to exploit. But a fundamental obstacle stood in their way: the tyranny of distance, imposed by a primitive land transportation system. The visionaries and the skeptics, the dream of the iron horse. In 1815, amidst this growing need for effective inland transportation, a visionary named Colonel John Stevens of New Jersey recognized a revolutionary possibility. While others saw the future in better roads and new canals, Stevens looked to the nascent power of steam. He secured a charter from the New Jersey legislature to build the first steam railroad in America. Stevens possessed a charter and a powerful dream, but he crucially lacked capital. When he approached the financial experts of his day, the men who controlled the flow of investment, his idea was met with derision. They dismissed the concept of a steam-powered locomotive as a wild and impractical scheme, a fantasy spun from coal smoke and hubris. In the early 19th century, transportation money was flowing, but not toward Stevens's radical vision. Investment was concentrated in three primary areas: road construction, canals, and rivercraft. Toll roads, often called turnpikes, were spreading across the landscape. These were an improvement over simple dirt tracks and were suitable for stagecoaches carrying passengers and mail. However, for the crucial task of hauling heavy freight, the costs were prohibitively high. Furthermore, away from these improved turnpikes, the back roads presented a common, formidable enemy to both stagecoaches and wagons: mud. In wet weather, roads dissolved into impassable quagmires, stranding travelers and goods for days or even weeks. The year 1825 marked a watershed moment with the completion of the long-awaited Erie Canal. This magnificent feat of engineering, stretching over 360 miles to connect the Hudson River with Lake Erie, was an immediate and spectacular commercial triumph. It opened up the Great Lakes region to the markets of the East Coast, transforming New York City into the nation's preeminent port. The canal's success swept the young nation into a passion for canals, a veritable canal mania. Before long, hundreds of these beautiful but incredibly expensive ditches adorned the American landscape. Yet the economic reality was harsh. Despite the frenzy of construction, only one canal, the mighty Erie, proved to be a lasting financial success. Many others became costly failures, monuments to ambition that failed to generate a return on their massive investments. Simultaneously, America's vast network of rivers was undergoing its own transformation. The slow, cumbersome rafts and flatboats that had long drifted downstream were giving way to the majestic, steam-driven paddle boats. These elegant and powerful craft, belching smoke and churning water, dominated the large rivers like the Mississippi, the Ohio, and the Hudson. They could defy the current, making upstream travel practical for the first time. However, their reach was limited by the very rivers they plied. They could not penetrate the great landlocked interior. As the nation expanded, towns, cities, and even entire states that were once content to remain isolated now felt an anxious desire to be tied together, to join the burgeoning national economy. This binding would require nothing less than a revolution in transportation. The birth of the railroad, from English mines to American tracks. The spark of that revolution had been kindled in England. As far back as 1804, an inventor named Richard Trevithick had ingeniously combined a high-pressure steam engine with a railway mine car to produce the world's first locomotive. English inventors like George Stephenson would continue to pioneer locomotive construction, refining the technology and putting railroads to public use. England's burgeoning success with this new mode of transport made some Americans curious, but the financial community remained deeply skeptical. As late as 1825, a full decade after receiving his charter, John Stevens still could not persuade anyone to invest in a railroad. Consumed by frustration but unyielding in his belief, he took matters into his own hands. On his own estate in Hoboken, New Jersey, he built a small steam wagon and ran it on a circular track. It was a demonstration, a proof of concept, and it holds the distinction of being the first locomotive to run on rails in America. The Industrial Revolution, raging on both sides of the Atlantic, was creating a whirlwind of experimentation. For mechanics and inventors, it was a golden age, a heyday of innovation. The railroad was an idea whose time was finally, inexorably, arriving. By the late 1820s, Americans were ready to try their hand at railroading in earnest, although at first, it was necessary to import locomotives from England, the established leader in the field. A pivotal moment came in 1830. An American-built locomotive, quaintly named Tom Thumb, made a trial run for America's first chartered common carrier railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio B&O. During this demonstration, the tiny locomotive was challenged to a race by a horse-drawn rail car. At the start, the horse surged ahead. Then, picking up steam, the locomotive forged into the lead, its mechanical heart pounding. But when a blower belt failed, causing the engine to lose steam, the horse claimed victory. It was perhaps the last great triumph of muscle over machine. Blood and sinew were ultimately no match for the raw power, relentless speed, and tireless endurance of this new breed of iron horse. America's first scheduled passenger service began on Christmas Day, 1830. A locomotive named the Best Friend of Charleston rattled along 6 miles of track at the then terrifying speed of 20 miles per hour. The public was captivated. 6 months later, however, disaster struck. The locomotive's fireman, reportedly annoyed by the hissing sound of escaping steam, made the fateful decision to fasten down the safety valve. The resulting pressure buildup turned the boiler into a bomb. Both the Best Friend and the unfortunate fireman were blown to pieces. Yet it was a triumphant age, one defined by a boundless optimism in technology. People marveled at this bold new creation, astonished that it worked at all. With a kind of blind enthusiasm, they overlooked the considerable dangers. Boilers sometimes exploded. Rigid locomotives, lacking the flexibility to navigate sharp turns, often jumped the track. Fiery smokestacks showered soot and hot sparks on the captive passengers, ruining clothes and occasionally setting fire to the wooden coaches. The jerky starts and stops were violent enough to throw people from their seats. But the momentum was unstoppable. The iron horse triumphs, outpacing the competition. While the public was captivated by the spectacle, careful businessmen noted the hard numbers. Railroad freight charges were, on average, only 1/4 as much as turnpike tolls. Wagon fees could be cut by 1/3. While canal rates were sometimes cheaper, the trade-offs were significant. Canal boats averaged a sluggish 4 miles per hour downstream and a mere 2 miles per hour upstream. What's more, the shallow waterways froze solid in the winter, bringing commerce to a complete halt for months. Railroads, by contrast, could run year-round, in almost all kinds of weather, and every day of the week, except in those pious times, often on Sunday. They could haul larger volumes and all kinds of goods, from fragile merchandise to heavy raw materials, faster than any other type of transport. For a nation bent on westward expansion, their timing was perfect. Perfect, that is, except for the formidable barriers that lay to the west. The Appalachian Mountains and other ranges presented challenges that caused even the boldest surveyors to pause, shake their heads, and turn back. In time, these barriers would be overcome through incredible feats of engineering, tunnels, bridges, and steep grades. Yet, it would take most early railroads more than 20 years to reach their original western destinations. Despite these hurdles, the growth was explosive. By 1840, railroad charters had been granted in 22 states, and 3,000 miles of track had been laid. For some, the railroad remained a thrilling novelty. For others, the canal operators, the turnpike owners, the stagecoach lines, the celebrated joke of the 1830s was fast becoming a serious commercial threat. The railroad could not be stopped. With steady increases in safety and rapid mechanical advances, it began to sweep rival forms of transportation from its path. Larger, more powerful locomotives were built. The invention of swiveling front-wheel trucks, a bogie, allowed the engines to navigate curves without derailing. Smokestacks were fitted with built-in spark arresters to protect passengers and prevent fires along the right-of-way. Open platforms gave way to enclosed engine cabs to protect the crew from the elements. The track itself evolved. Heavy stone blocks used as foundations were replaced by cheaper, more resilient wooden cross ties. The earliest rails, which were simply wooden beams topped with thin iron straps that could peel away and cause accidents, were replaced by the solid iron T-rail, a design that remains the standard to this day. Safety features, however rudimentary, were beginning to protect man and beast. Between 1840 and 1850, the nation's rail network tripled in mileage. During this pivotal decade, railroads transcended their initial role. They no longer just maintained existing commerce. They began to create it. Wherever the iron rail and the flanged wheel went, they opened new markets for merchants in the cities, new farmland for settlers on the frontier, and new jobs for everyone, from managers and engineers to day laborers. In the 1840s, the great orator Daniel Webster declared that the railroad towered above all other inventions of this or the preceding age. It was a stunning validation for an idea that, less than 25 years before, its prophet, John Stevens, could not get money to build because it was deemed too wild and too impractical. Binding a nation, westward expansion, and the coming storm. By 1851, the transformation was undeniable. New York City officials presented a citation to the Erie Railroad proclaiming, "Resolved, that we hail the completion of this gigantic and stupendous work as emphatically the work of the age." These were impressive words for a method of transportation still in its adolescence. For the railroad, however, true maturity lay just ahead. There was a nation to build, and soon a nation to bind. After the 1840s, railroads experienced phenomenal growth. Rail lines had already tied together the eastern coastal cities. Now they pushed westward, touching the waters of Lake Erie and the Ohio and Tennessee rivers, which in turn flowed into the mighty Mississippi. Railroad schedules began to impose a new reality, forcing people to change their very concept of time. On the Pennsylvania Railroad, it took a mere 15 hours to get from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. By stagecoach, that same journey had taken 6 grueling days. Past the Alleghenies and the Appalachians lay America's heartland, the prairie. This vast domain stretched for endless miles, but its rich soil posed a unique challenge. The tough prairie sod stuck like glue to the cast-iron plows of the first settlers. Then, in 1837, an Illinois blacksmith named John Deere invented a plow with a highly polished steel blade that could cut cleanly through the soil. Around the same time, Cyrus McCormick's mechanical reaper revolutionized harvesting, multiplying the output of a single farmer. Windmills, taking advantage of the strong prairie winds, pumped water and ran machines. Now, settlers truly began to carve out homesteads from the wilderness. Events in Europe propelled this migration. Political unrest and, most devastatingly, a potato famine in Ireland sent waves of refugees seeking a new life in a new land. They came to America, some taking their chances on the prairie, others becoming tenant farmers for land speculators. In this vast wilderness, largely devoid of roads and navigable rivers, the iron tentacles of the railroad began to spread. They were the vital link that got the goods to market. Because of their speed and hauling capacity, Railroads could move perishable products like milk and fruit, and carry heavy raw materials and manufactured goods between the industrial East and the new inland settlements. In the wake of this rail traffic, civilization followed. Railroad towns began to spring up all over the landscape. Most had high hopes of someday becoming a major rail junction like Atlanta or Chattanooga, but most, like Sturgis, Michigan, ended up as little more than a whistle stop. In 1850, the federal government initiated a new policy that would accelerate this growth. It granted the Illinois Central Railroad alternate sections of public land adjacent to its right-of-way. This land, made valuable by the very presence of the railroad, was then sold to settlers to finance construction. 6 years later, with 700 miles of track, the Illinois Central was the longest railroad in the world. Between 1850 and 1860, about 20 million acres of public lands were granted to various railroads. In return, these land-grant railroads were required to transport government personnel, property, and mail at reduced rates. For the government, it was a strategic investment. Only a small portion of its 1.5 billion acres of heartland had been sold, even at the giveaway price of $1.25 an acre. According to one senator, the rest of the land could lay there for 500 years, if dependable transportation could not be provided. During this period, the locomotive evolved from a purely functional machine into a work of art and a symbol of national pride. Brightly colored engines, prized by their engineers and a builder's delight, came complete with shiny brass trim and elaborate scrollwork. To 19th century Americans, these gay wood burners were pretty enough to set in their parlors. Trains had captured the minds of hard-nosed businessmen. Now they captured the hearts of the people. The rush and roar of a passing train filled spectators with awe and wonder. What boy did not secretly hope to one day become an engineer or a conductor? A distant blast of the whistle could be the call of destiny, a call to adventure, freedom, and new possibilities. Trains were going farther and farther west, and "Go west, young man," was the advice of the age. By the middle of the 19th century, America's frontier had stretched well beyond the Mississippi River. The far west was booming. There was cheap farmland in Oregon and, most enticingly, gold in California. By 1855, government survey crews had mapped out 5 potential railroad routes to the Pacific Ocean. By the late 1850s, tracks had crossed the state of Missouri and reached the edge of the settled frontier. Back east, railroads continued to grow at an astounding rate. The city of Boston had 7 different railroads and 7 separate railroad stations. And on the shore of Lake Michigan, Chicago, a swampy frontier village of just 300 people in the 1830s, was now served by 11 different railroads, making it the largest rail center in the nation. But as the ribbons of iron began to pull the agrarian West closer to the industrial East, a deep and bitter chasm was tearing the nation apart. The North and South were torn asunder by the Civil War. For the first time in history, railroads would be involved in large-scale warfare. It was a time of frenzied building and, simultaneously, a time of frenzied destruction. The railroad at war, a new era of military logistics. The Civil War fundamentally changed the nature of military logistics. Armies supplied by traditional horse-drawn wagons could operate only about 100 miles from their base. Any further, and the teams of animals going back and forth to carry supplies would consume the very contents of their wagons. Railroads, however, could move troops and supplies at speeds and over distances never before possible. Generals on both sides, trained in the old rules of war at West Point, stayed up late at night trying to reconcile their classical strategies with the new logistical realities of the railroad. Between the North and the South, there were powerful distinctions that would prove decisive. The North had nearly 3 times as much track, and its equipment, personnel, and material resources were far superior. The Erie and Pennsylvania railroads alone had more locomotives than the entire Confederacy. Even more critically, the Confederacy did not have the industrial capacity to build new ones or even adequately repair the ones they had. During the war, events like the Andrews Raid or the Great Locomotive Chase etched railroads into the history books. In April 1862, at Big Shanty, Georgia, 20 Union raiders disguised as civilians stole a Confederate locomotive named the General. Their objective was to race north, burning bridges and destroying the vital rail line between Atlanta and Chattanooga. Led by their conductor, William Fuller, the Southern crewmen gave chase, first on foot, then by handcar, and finally by commandeering a series of locomotives. Mile after mile, the thrilling chase continued. The close pursuit prevented the Union raiders from carrying out their destructive plans. About 20 miles short of Chattanooga, the general ran out of fuel. All 20 raiders were captured, their leader James J. Andrews, and 7 others were later hanged as spies. In one of the final decisive campaigns of the war, General William T. Sherman's March to the Sea. A single rail line nearly 500 miles long supplied an army of over 100,000 troops as it cut a swath of destruction through the heart of the Confederacy. Afterwards, General Sherman himself stated that his extensive campaign would have been impossible without the railroad. At the close of the war, a special train draped in black left the capital of the reunited United States. The same rails that had carried a victorious President Abraham Lincoln to his inauguration in Washington 4 years earlier now guided his body back home to the plains of Illinois. Lincoln had fought tirelessly to keep the North and the South united, and in 1862, during the gravest moments of the war, he had signed into law the Pacific Railroad Act. This act provided for the building of the first Transcontinental Railroad, a railroad that would soon achieve on a continental scale what he had fought to preserve for the nation: unity. It would bind the East with the West,